At 3:14 a.m., the air inside a windowless casino feels thick, almost electric. A man named Elias sits on a small stool, his hands trembling slightly as he feeds his last $20 bill into a machine. Most people would look at him and see a man losing his rent money, his dignity, or his future. His sister thinks he's just irresponsible. His friends think he has a luck problem. But they are all looking at the wrong thing. Elias isn't just chasing money. He is caught in a sophisticated neurological trap that modern science is only beginning to map out. You see, for Elias, the most dangerous moment isn't when he loses, it's when he almost wins. When the reels spin and stop just 1 inch away from the jackpot, his brain doesn't register a loss. It registers a near success, triggering a surge of dopamine more powerful than a real win ever could. Once you understand the invisible strings being pulled inside the gambler's mind, you'll realize that the house doesn't just win because of the math, it wins because it knows how to hack the human soul. This is the story of why we stay when we should run, and why the chase is the most addictive drug on earth. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. I'll write the full narrative now, picking up directly from the hook and introduction you've established. He had told himself it was the last one. He always told himself it was the last one. The bill disappeared into the mouth of the machine with a soft mechanical sigh, and Elias watched the credits blink to life on the screen, a small green number that represented 3 days of skipped lunches, 1 unpaid utility reminder, and the very last margin between himself and a conversation he could not bear to have. His fingers found the spin button by instinct, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, and the reels began their familiar churning. 3 symbols blurred into motion. Then the first one locked. A diamond. The second locked half a breath later. Another diamond. His chest tightened. The third reel slowed, it always slowed, as though the machine itself understood the theatrical weight of the moment, and stopped on a bar. 1 symbol away. 1 single, maddening symbol away from everything changing. And here is where science diverges sharply from common sense. Elias's brain, in that precise instant, did not process a loss. Deep in the circuitry of his limbic system, a small explosion of dopamine fired, larger, measurably larger, than the chemical response he'd had 3 weeks ago when he'd actually won $40. The near miss had done what the win could not. It had convinced his neurology that he was close. That the pattern was real. That the next spin was the one. He sat back on the stool, heart hammering, and felt something that a rational observer would find deeply disturbing: hope. It had started, as these things often do, with a moment that felt like grace. 3 months earlier, Elias had been sitting in this same casino on a Tuesday afternoon, not because he was a gambler, he was clear on that point, he was very clear, but because he had nowhere else to sit with his particular brand of grief. His mother had died 11 weeks before that. The apartment was full of her things. His sister Nadia kept calling to talk about feelings, and Elias did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was carrying. The casino was loud and bright and asked nothing of him. The machine in front of him required only that he press a button, and for a man whose interior life had become unbearable, the simplicity of that transaction was a form of mercy. He had put in $40, mostly to justify the seat, and won $612. The money had meant very little. What it meant, what his brain encoded that afternoon with the precision of a surgeon's instrument, was this: here is a place where, without warning, the universe corrects itself. Here is a place where the numbers go right. His rent had been 3 weeks late. His mother's medical invoices were stacked on his kitchen counter like a small paper monument to helplessness. And then, without any particular effort or merit, $612 had appeared. His brain did not file this under luck. It filed it under solution. What Elias discovered in the weeks that followed was not gambling in the way most people picture it. He did not discover cards or dice or the social theater of a poker table. What he discovered was something quieter and, in its own way, more total. Researchers who study behavioral addiction have a term for the state he was learning to enter. They call it the machine zone. It is not excitement, exactly. It is closer to erasure. When Elias settled in front of a screen and the rhythm of the spins took over, the button, the blur, the lock, the outcome, the button again, something happened to the clock. The world outside the machine's glow became abstract, theoretical. His mother's stack of bills on the counter receded. Nadia's unanswered texts grew distant. The low, constant pressure behind his sternum that he'd been carrying since the funeral eased its grip, not because anything had changed, but because the present moment had been successfully reduced to a single, repeating question: what will the next spin show? Neurologically, this state shares more with dissociation than it does with pleasure. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for consequence, for future orientation, for the voice that says you have work tomorrow, goes quiet. What remains is the older brain, the one that evolved to track patterns in random environments, the one that is constitutionally incapable of accepting that something is truly random. That ancient hardware scans every spin for meaning. It finds sequences where there are none. It builds cathedrals out of coincidence. Elias thought he had found peace. He had found a far more complicated thing. By the 5th week, he had lost $1,100. He knew the number precisely because he had written it in the Notes app on his phone, the same place he tracked his budget, in a column he had labeled temporary deficit. The label was doing a lot of work. He could not stop, and the reason he could not stop was a piece of cognitive architecture so deeply embedded in human psychology that economists have studied it for decades. The money already spent was not, in any rational sense, a reason to spend more. A financial advisor, a mathematician, anyone operating from pure logic would confirm this: a previous loss does not improve the odds of a future win. The machine has no memory. Every spin is its own universe, statistically independent of every spin before it. Elias knew this. He had a degree in accounting. He had explained this very principle to clients. He stayed anyway. What held him was the sunk cost fallacy in its most visceral form, not the academic version described in textbooks, but the lived, embodied version that feels less like a logical error and more like loyalty. He had given this machine $1,100. Walking away meant accepting, permanently and without appeal, that the $1,100 was simply gone. Staying meant it was still in play. Still convertible. The loss existed in a kind of quantum state, neither fully real nor fully avoidable, for as long as he kept spinning. The moment he walked out the door, it would collapse into certainty. So he did not walk out the door. What kept him coming back, beyond the sunk cost, was a mechanism that behavioral scientists have identified as the most potent reinforcement schedule known to produce compulsive behavior. It is not the promise of a guaranteed reward. It is the opposite. Variable ratio reinforcement, the technical term for the slot machine's core design, works by making the reward unpredictable. The win could come on the very next spin. It could come after 300. There is no way to know, and that unknowability is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Pigeons subjected to this schedule will peck a lever until they collapse. Rats will cross electrified floors for it. Humans will feed their rent money into a machine at 3 a.m. for it. The intermittency is not incidental. The near miss, the 2 diamonds and a bar, is not a malfunction. It is engineered. Modern machines are calibrated to produce near misses at frequencies that would not occur naturally in a truly random system, because the designers understood, long before the neuroimaging studies confirmed it, that the almost win was more powerful than the win itself. Elias was not being unlucky. He was being played with extraordinary precision. He had developed rituals by then, the way sailors once developed rituals before storms. He tapped the screen twice in the upper left corner before a spin. He changed machines if he lost 3 times in a row, then changed back after sitting out 2 spins at the new one. He wore the same gray hoodie he'd been wearing the night he won the $600. None of these behaviors had any causal relationship to the outcomes. The algorithm generating each spin's result was indifferent to his hoodie, his tapping pattern, and his seat selection. He knew this the same way he knew the sunk cost fallacy was a fallacy. He tapped the screen anyway. The rituals were not stupidity. They were the symptom of a brain doing exactly what it was built to do, imposing agency on an environment where none existed. The illusion of control is not a personality flaw. It is a survival mechanism that has, in the context of a slot machine, been turned against the very person it evolved to protect. His sister Nadia had cooked dinner on a Thursday. Rice and stew, his mother's recipe, the smell of which hit him in the chest when he walked through her door. She had set the table carefully. She wanted to talk about the estate, about their mother's jewelry, about whether Elias was sleeping. She had noticed, she said, gently, that he seemed far away. He sat across from her and lied with a fluency that frightened him later when he replayed it. The money was fine. Work was steady. He was sleeping well enough. He was just processing things in his own way, which she had to respect because they were different people who grieved differently. Nadia had looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then let it go. He drove directly from her apartment to the casino. Not because he had planned to. Because the weight of the dinner, the smell of the food, the careful way she had set the table, all of it had cracked something open that the machine zone was uniquely designed to seal back shut. He was down nearly $3,000 by the time the calendar turned to that particular Tuesday. He no longer called it a deficit in his notes app. He had deleted the column. What he called it now, internally, was a temporary position, a distance from the surface that he would close, in a single session, when his system finally aligned with the machine's rhythm. The system was, of course, a fiction. But it was a necessary fiction, because the alternative, that he had spent $3,000 he did not have on a machine that was statistically indifferent to his existence, was a truth too heavy to carry into the casino and still function. So he came back, the way the bereaved return to a grave. Not because it helped. Because it was the only place the loss had an address. What happens to the brain when the jackpot lights finally fire is not, it turns out, what the movies suggest. There is no sustained flood of euphoria. The dopamine spike is sharp and brief, neuroimaging studies measure it in seconds. Then the system recalibrates, tolerance asserts itself, and the baseline reasserts its gravity. What the gambler chasing a jackpot is actually chasing is not the reward itself but the anticipation of the reward, which the brain codes as more pleasurable than the reward's arrival. This is the trap inside the trap. The jackpot, when it came on a Wednesday at 11:40 p.m. Elias had been in the machine zone for 4 hours, the world reduced to the lit rectangle in front of him. The reel spun. They locked. All 3 diamonds. The machine erupted, sound, light, a number on the screen that took him several seconds to parse as real. $4,200. He sat very still. The bells were still ringing. People nearby turned to look. And Elias felt, spreading through him like cold water, an emotion he had not anticipated. Nothing. No, not nothing. Something more specific and more terrible than nothing. He felt the machine zone beginning to end. The noise was breaking the trance. The money was making him remember the rent, the invoices, his sister's face across the dinner table, the smell of his mother's stew. The jackpot had not solved the problem. The jackpot had interrupted the only solution he'd found. And before the casino attendant had finished processing the payout, before the cash was physically in his hand, Elias understood with complete clarity what he was about to do. He was going to put it back. Not all of it, he told himself. Just enough to get back into the zone. Just long enough to feel the hum again. Just one more hour in the place where the grief had no volume. He was already reaching for the machine. He walked out at 3:17 a.m. with $40 and the slow, specific shame of someone who has watched himself do something irreversible while being fully conscious and fully unable to stop. The parking lot was cold. The sky had the particular blue-black quality of an hour that belongs to no one, too late for the night crowd and too early for the morning. He sat in his car for a long time without starting it. The thing he had spent 3 months refusing to name was finally, in the silence and the cold, nameable. He was not a man with a system. He was not a man who had been unlucky. He was a man in grief, with a brain that had been hijacked by an industry that had studied his neurochemistry more carefully than he ever had. The near misses had not been accidents. The variable rewards had not been chance. The machine zone had not been peace. It had been a pharmaceutical-grade substitute for the unbearable work of sitting with loss. He could not outsmart the algorithm. He had an accounting degree and a grief he'd never learned to carry, and the machine had known exactly how to use the second one against him. He pulled out his phone. Not to check the casino app. Not to calculate what he'd have won if he'd stopped 2 hours earlier. He opened his contacts and found Nadia's name. It was 3:22 in the morning. She answered on the second ring.